Hey, folks, welcome back to the latest episode of the Fault Line podcast. My partner, Kim Scribner, and I are excited for the episode today. We sat down with Melissa Reeve, the author who just put out a book called Hyperadaptive, Rewiring to Become an AI Native Organization. And, Melissa is someone we've spoken to in the past, and we were both excited by the topics that we got into. I appreciated some of her historic perspective, and I also appreciated how we sort of contemplated what transformation is versus change. Kim, what were some of the highlights for you as you reflect back on the conversation that our listeners are about to hear?
Yeah, I love sitting down with Melissa. We come from similar backgrounds, and I love the fact that she's using rewiring instead of transformation because it helps us think about the complexity of organizations and how AI is our next thing that we need to adopt and figure out how it integrates into our organizations. I hope our audience enjoys the episode.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the latest episode of The Fault Line, the podcast where my partner Kim Scribner and I talk about the realities of trying to get stuff done, that point where strategy meets the real world, and how we bridge those fault lines that erupt or can spread to be productive and keep things moving forward. And today we're welcoming back a friend of ours, and we're going to talk about AI and, let's try to separate some of the hype from the reality as we go through the conversation today. And with that, Melissa, I'll dish it over to you. Maybe just remind our listeners who you are and how you come at this particular topic.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gary, and such a pleasure to be back on the show. It was a great conversation last time. And by way of introduction, Melissa Reeve, I'm the author of a book called Hyperadaptive, Rewiring the Enterprise to Become AI Native. And the basic premise is that AI is going to compress organizations, rewire them. How do we get from the organization of today incrementally and iteratively into the organization of tomorrow while keeping the business running?
Love that. And, I think my first question coming off of that gets right to the heart of this hype versus reality. I just heard you say iterative and, making progress. And if we were to believe everything we read in the media these days, AI comes across more like a magic wand that will transform. A caterpillar organization will emerge as a beautiful butterfly. And my suspicion is that it's not quite that singular in terms of the moment, nor is it that transformative, a change in that moment. And I'm curious what your sort of reflections on that might be and how you might flesh out that scenario.
We should also talk, Melissa, about the word transformation and whether we believe that's a good word or not in this context.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
yes.
love that you're poking on the word transformation, and I have chosen to adopt it yet again, even though it implies that it is like a caterpillar coming from a cocoon. I've leaned into it. One, because I see that's the title I see people adopting. I'm the head of AI transformation, and yet anybody who's been in this space longer than two minutes knows that it's a journey that never really ends and not a point in time. Uh, that is as the framing, I think the media is playing such a big role right now in creating this hype umbrella. And I'm sure we'll dive into that. But when I was writing the book, I really tried to take the lessons learned from everything from business process reengineering to digital transformation to things like agile transformations and integrate lessons learned. And what we learned from all of those activities, one is, Kim, to your point, it's not a point in time, right? It's not something that you do, you check the box and you say, okay, well, we're done with the transformation. The other lesson learned is that big bang transformations rarely worked. There was something like a 70% failure rate on those transformations. And I'm sure you guys have war stories from the trenches. And it's partially because, um, a lot of these were led either top down or bottom up. And what the research from Harvard has shown is that top down rarely works because it disconnects, it's the fault line, strategy from execution, and bottom up hits its limitations because we don't have one, it might not be connected to strategy. Two, people lack the positional authority to really make horizontal change happen. And so, what the research shows is that actually middle out change is the most long lasting, and incremental change is the most long lasting. And so, as we're separating hype from reality in the AI space, I think that's an interesting lens to put on the hype.
I would sort of reflect on a couple of the elements that you just touched on, Melissa. First of all, there are two aspects that we're talking about here, and AI and the effect that it can have in how we do work, how we relate with our colleagues, how collectively we achieve the creation and dissemination of things of value. And the other part is this sort of arc of change. And I've long believed that transformation is almost a marketing term to help get buy-in internally or to get somebody to join, because iterative evolutionist sounds more like somebody who's going to go be, digging in the hills of Montana looking for fossils. Even though that sort of methodical approach is oftentimes much more effective and has much more resilience than throwing the big Frankenstein switch and holding a party.
Mhm.
But I think, terminology that's kind of important around the word transformation is being purposeful about it and understanding why you're trying to transform. And I think if we're in transformation, if we're not starting with that why question, we might as well not do it at all. And the same is true for adopting AI. If leaders just say, I'm going to buy you a whole bunch of tools, but we're not going to think about how to use them, what makes them more effective, we're not being purposeful, and it will fail the same way that those 70-something% of transformations do.
Mm. Yeah,
And
and
to
it
that
kind of
point, Kim, just I think along with purposeful is understanding what the ripple effects are, how this
yeah.
cascades, and being comprehensive, right? Because a lot of times there are these approaches like, hey, we went to the store, we bought a bunch of technologies, look, we're better. And there isn't this appreciation of what the practitioners need, et cetera. So, Melissa, I know you had some perspective on this. I'll dish it to you.
Yeah, and I want to dig into the word purposeful as it relates to hype versus reality, because what I see, and I'd be curious what you both see, is executives that are claiming a purpose, but that purpose is maybe misinformed or ill-informed or not fully formed. And so maybe they read the headlines and they see these huge productivity gains, these AI native companies coming out of Silicon Valley who are getting 23x, productivity gains or revenue per head count, and they want that. And then that becomes the purpose. And I'd like to push back on it, because if you are an executive and you are creating a quote unquote purpose based on other people's businesses, based on other people's outcomes, I feel like it's very thin, and it doesn't stand the stress test of your business. And so I feel like purpose from headlines is looks different than purpose from a true place of understanding and a knowledge of your business.
Kim
Yeah,
is smirking.
100,000% if that was the number, because similar to in the more way back times when people would say, I want to adopt Agile, and we would say, why? And they would say, because I want to do, book title coming here of somebody that we all might know, or at least Melissa and I may know, half, twice the work in half the time.
Mhm.
That is not actually possible. You cannot do twice the work in half the time. You can do more meaningful work, and that is a better purpose than just doing more work. And so I agree with you, Melissa, in that those of us who might be helping organizations adopt AI have to be pushing on them to get to a real purpose. Like, what is the reason why we're doing this? Not just to be more efficient, but something beyond that.
And I think also to understand the applicability and the context of a specific organization, its competitive environment, its team capabilities. This is the comprehensiveness part, because listen, the players have changed slightly. We're talking about AI today, but to your point, Kim, we've been through this with Agile. We went through this with e-commerce. We've been, there are all these waves of technical innovation and change. And I think the hard part is to help people understand the headlines are attractive, and they're attractive for a reason, right? There are those examples out there. And sometimes we're in a circumstance where that is a reasonable aspiration. In other cases, the aspiration is maybe more modest, but still profound, relevant to the competitive set or relative to our track record. So there are breakthroughs. They may not make it into a business publication or a Harvard Business Review case study, but that doesn't make them any less valuable. And this brings me back to something that you just talked about, Melissa, which was the middle out sort of change agenda. And I tend to frame this in sort of a nautical term. I think of change from the engine room, bottom up, change from the helm, top down. And there are pros and cons of both. And it's okay to start with one of those. I think the failure mode for me is when the other end of the spectrum doesn't buy in or isn't brought into the dialogue. And when those two are in conflict with one another, that unravels a whole bunch of stuff. So when the top of the house says, we're going to adopt AI, and everybody who has to use it is unaware of how it might be applied or what the importance is, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you've got all the people who are doing stuff willy-nilly, figuring it out chaotically on their own, it's not orchestrated, and you're likely to under-deliver and run into resistance from leaders who haven't been brought along. Does that feel accurate, or am I kind of mischaracterizing some things?
That feels accurate. And in the other podcast we did, I think I talked about this notion of an AI North Star as an aligning mechanism. And so just for the folks who maybe haven't heard that one, the example I think I gave on that last one was Moderna saying we're going to release 15 new drugs in 5 years with the help of AI. And maybe for a fresh example, I'll pull on Coursera, who wanted to go into more international markets. And when you think about that as an AI North Star, the word AI isn't even in that business goal. And yet what they were able to unlock, so they're at the helm, they're saying this is the direction the ship is going, to build on your metaphor. And then it serves as that alignment where everybody else can interpret that into their position, their role. And one of the main choke points for doing that was translation. At the time, it was taking them, I think, 12 months or something crazy like that to translate a course. And it also took them a lot of effort. And with AI, they were able to dramatically reduce the amount of effort it took to translate their materials, translate the courses. And using AI, they were actually able to make it very realistic, right? Match the instructor's pacing and tone. But it also unlocked this larger business goal of getting into more international markets. And that's what we're looking for, right? And I think, Gary, that's what I just heard you describe. It's like the people at the top still have to say, here's where the ship is going. And people in the middle need to interpret that so they can connect operational reality to that strategy. And then people on the front lines need to feel empowered to change the way they're working and this is the key point, in a non-threatening way without feeling like, crap, I've spent my whole life translating. Is my job going to go away?
Yeah.
So two things in what you just said kind of resonate with me. So first of all, I love the starting with the middle, because being a agile coach, the middle was always the forgotten layer of people. And so starting with the middle is starting with folks who can reach to those that report to them, that are on the front lines, and who can reach up, right? So we accomplish that by starting at that position. So I love that. that statement that you made. The other thing is, I feel like often organizations are saying things like powered by AI in order to gain marketing traction because
Or
it's about
investor relations traction.
yeah. So it makes people pay attention, even though maybe that's not the most important part of what they're doing. To your point, they're getting into international markets, and that was a goal. Or we're releasing drugs faster, which helps people be more healthy, right? Those are the actual goals that we're after. Not implementing AI is not the goal. It might be helping us achieve that.
And for me, that's the hype versus the reality. Um, I'm wired every day that I go to work on behalf of a client, or when I was in leadership roles with corporations, I walk in thinking, are my efforts today going to drive sales, profit, and market share? And I'm a competitive guy. I like to beat the snot out of my competition. So what I looked for was not to signal, here are the tools I'm using. I just wanted to generate those numbers: more sales, better profitability, higher market share. And I think this is where the hype of AI, and we see it all over the place. People using .ai for their URLs now, people talking about powered by AI, et cetera. And to your point, Kim, I think they're distracting from the core issues, which is the value proposition going to hunt and appeal to the people we want to serve? And that's one of those separators for me that goes right along with, and bringing it back, Melissa, to some of your perspective, the buy-in from the organization itself. Because underneath everything that both of you just talked about, is the fact that change is social,
Mm-hmm.
right? Unless you're a sole proprietor and you are CEO and full employee base, change is social. There are other people who choose to come into it. And I am curious, Melissa, you touched on this idea of safety. In software engineering and in a lot of tech companies, AI has been a threat
Mm-hmm.
to those folks. Good for potentially the corporations themselves and their productivity, but really bad for a lot of individuals who've now lost their job coding. In a more lower tech environment, as we think about this, how might we frame the hype versus the reality in AI helping organizations transform, evolve, change, adapt, and become more competitive?
Yeah. So there's so much richness in that question. The first thing I want to shine a light on is what I call AI sense making. And AI is so big and it's so amorphous that it's hard for any one of us to really parse through and say, this is what AI means for me in my role. And we're really changing at multiple levels at once. So as an individual, our individual identity is evolving alongside AI. Our job might change, our role might change. And then at a company level, our company's identity, how we're operating, is changing alongside of that. Our role as a leader might be changing, and then society is potentially changing alongside. So there's this is a big one, right? This is a
Yes.
lot of change happening at once, and I think we're not giving people enough time to really sort through it in trusted community. To your change is social. Who are the trusted people, our peer circles or communities of practice with whom we can have honest conversations about how AI could impact our roles, have these important conversations with our managers. Do our managers really know? No, they don't know because they haven't done their own AI sense making. Our leaders don't even know, and we can't have honest conversations there because they don't even really know. So it is. I just want to shine a light on how difficult of a time this really is, and we're not really giving it credit.
Well, and then layer on top of that, AI is not the only big change that we're all dealing with, right? We're past pandemic, but the US especially is in a bit of a social battleground, if you will, at the moment. And people are dealing with lots of different things and then layering this on top of it.
Yeah. And there is, I think it's funny. I'm reflecting on conversations I've had with people of different generations throughout my own life, right? About the race and pace of change, the scale of it. I remember talking to my grandmother, right, who predated, as a child, predated television, saw television, saw the internet, etc. And she was probably an unusual woman for her age in her early adoption of things like the internet and technology. And here we are, the change isn't going away. Societal change, political discourse, economic disruptions. And oh, by the way, there's this thing that could fundamentally alter how you do the work you do. And collectively, how we deliver value to the people we're trying to serve. And, we talked about it a little bit before we got on the air. I always try to remind myself never to underestimate how human beings will over or underestimate. And as we apply that sentiment to AI, we can start to filter, again, the hype, right? You see these media headlines about a dystopian future where the bots are going to take over and humans are obsoleted. We see other headlines that talk about how we're going to achieve a singularity of positivity because AI is going to enable some things. My sense is, and again, I'm going to dish it back to both of you for comment on this, but my sense is the truth is going to be a little more pedestrian. We're going to shake out the real value add elements where AI is essentially useful, utilitarian from some of that hype stuff, at least in the near term.
Yeah, and the hype grabs headlines. I feel like the reality, it may be pedestrian. I actually think it'll be pretty revolutionary or evolutionary, much like the way electricity really was this general purpose technology. What we've seen in through the historical lens, and I cover this in the book, is what happens when we bring in automation, whether it's factory automation, whether it's DevOps, whether it's things like electricity. We see jobs going from doing the thing to building, monitoring, and maintaining the automations that do the things.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the examples I pull on is the washing machine. I, for
Yes.
one, don't want to go back to beating clothes on a rock or running them through a roller. I'm very, very happy with that automation. Thank you very much. And yet an entire industry was spawned with the development of the washing machine. When I think about now we're building these machines and somebody has to maintain them and somebody has to build them. And yes, there is displacement. And I think that is the heart of it. Is what happens to the junior programmers who now feel like I'm out of a job. And I feel like that's where organizations are short on the answers. And we can talk about that a little bit. I think the reality is we'll be okay. I don't think it's a dystopian future. I think new industries are going to spawn up. I've recently been saying my vision for a new industry of the future is I'm standing on a stage in Beijing, China. I am speaking fluent Chinese. My gesticulation and pacing is just as I am doing it right now live, and it's a 3D hologram. And I am standing in the hologram booth in my home and I'm speaking English. It's instantly getting translated and instantly it's the holodeck in reality, and we'll finally get there. So I think it's actually, in my view, Gary, it's not quite pedestrian, but it's not dystopian.
So in
I
that
think, like,
regard,
to pull on some of what Melissa was saying, right? First of all, I'm thankful that I never had to wash laundry that way. But also, like, we're not going from the Flintstones to the Jetsons, right? Like, we've been promised the Jetsons for a really long period of time, right? We all watched it as children, and we're still not there yet. I would, going on a laundry example, love for my laundry to push a button and it comes out and it's folded and it's wonderful and Rosie did her job and all of those things. Um, I don't know about pedestrian, but I do think, like, there's an opportunity for upskilling or skill repositioning, to your point, Melissa. And so how do we just prepare organizations to do that better and make sure that leaders are not just checking a box with AI, but are actually thinking about this as a change that does affect humans. So, we always talk about people, process, and technology, and AI is the technology. We've got to make sure that the processes are in place, but the people are the most important part of that.
And before you comment on that, Melissa, you used the term displacement, which I think is the first time in this conversation that topic has arisen. And I'm also curious how profound you think AI influence changes will work out, because you touched on electricity, right? And I like history, and I spent a fair amount of time looking at first steam power and then electrical power as it related to the Industrial Revolution. And if you go back to the mid 19th century, right, we had agrarian industries that were displaced and moved into cities, so that it created an urbanization. It completely altered social structures in a number of different countries. So pedestrian to me was more like, hey, let's step back from the hype and think about the utility of AI rather than just the hyperbole. But that doesn't mean that it won't be profound. Do you think it's on an order of electrification in terms of how pervasive and broad it will be? How much displacement do you think there might be? And then bringing it back to where Kim was, how does that shape us as individuals, shape how leaders view their organizations, and potentially how leaders in society think about our societies? It's a big
these are
question,
big.
but I am curious about your take on it.
How much time do you have, Melissa?
Yeah. Well, luckily I have a few stats at hand. So the World Economic Forum, their jobs Future of Jobs 2030 report gives us some numbers, and it says that 92 million jobs are going away. It says 170 million jobs will be created. It's a net gain of 78 million jobs. When you think about that, though, that is a huge amount of displacement. And I do have the question of who owns that displacement. Is it individuals who are responsible for their own upskilling? Is it the government? Is it our higher education institutions? Is it corporations? And for the leaders listening to this, I would like to suggest that it's probably one, it's all of them. Two, if you are in a position of leadership in a corporation, really think about this issue of displacement. Because what I see now is I see leadership and boards wanting to harvest the gains of AI and then say, pull a Jack Dorsey move and lay off 4,000 people because AI is going to give us all this productivity. Think about the institutional knowledge that's going out the door. Think about your organization's mission. So, is it really Block's goal to just become a smaller company? Is there one of their competitors going to set a more ambitious goal for their company and say we can achieve that big, hairy, audacious goal that we've always wanted to achieve if we hang on to our people? Does it look more like some of the leading organizations, Unilever and MetLife, who acknowledge that there's massive upskilling to take place? Say, recruiting is one of our biggest costs, and it's cheaper to retrain people and hang on to that institutional knowledge. We've hired good people rather than harvest those gains and say it's all about efficiency. I think these are the decisions that leaders really need to make. And I think this is how we go beyond the hype into the reality of a future that we all have the power to create.
Love that. I love that. And, for me, there's a time element to those considerations as well, because, and to your point about all those different stakeholders and who's accountable, I do believe it is all of the above and inclusive. I also have a strong belief that each society or nation will be coming to those determinations through its own cultural and governmental filters. So how Germany or the European Union approaches this is going to feel fundamentally different than how it's approached here in the States in some meaningful ways. And I'm not naive enough to try to speculate that there's a right or wrong, but the framing that you talked about, Melissa, of the benefits of AI balanced against the costs of the choices we're making to achieve them is something that I think we all would be we would all benefit from considering those, right?
Hmm.
And kind of weighing those as we make choices, because a near-term gain could result in a medium to longer term set of challenges. And, without it being a survival moment, sometimes, absorbing a little bit more cost in the near term actually leads to greater value over time.
Yeah, and
And
I love
that's,
that you're pointing to the systems because you think about the way the U.S. stock system performs, the stock market, quarterly performance, and how we've shifted from capitalism into maybe toxic capitalism, and we're in this current where the common good doesn't seem to be as important as it used to be. And so what are the implications of those things layered on top of this moment of AI? We're going for the profit, we're not focused on the common good. What are the unintended consequences of that in this country, given maybe a country that where the common good still feels like it's more important?
yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
on
mean,
that,
I would argue the common good has not been very important in my entire lifetime. So we're pretty far away from lots of countries where we're supporting the common good, right? Organizations are there to make money. And that has been true for many, 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 many years. And so, when I hear some of my friends who are maybe not in the tech space or the executive leadership space like some of us are talking about, I'm not going to use AI because they use too much water for data centers. You just don't understand how it works if that's your premise for not using AI. But those are the fears that still exist. And some of those things we're still trying to overcome. I live in a place where we use more water to serve golf courses than anything else. So the
and
common
you
good
don't
goes
even
out the
golf.
window as soon as people want to go golfing here, right?
But I think the reality is that, you know, groups of humans uh, that coalesce, and nation states tends to be our organizing principle on this in many regards, sort of stake out a spectrum of comfort on that individual versus collective rights and goods and benefits. And most countries, will make their choices within that sort of cultural norm spectrum. The US tends to skew greater toward, more prominently towards the individual rights. I mean, heck, we've got founding documents that say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's very different than, let's say, Canada, where they talk about good government, or other places. And I think those are some of those things that will influence how collectively we grapple with the dislocations. And to your point, Melissa, in one sense, with 8 billion people on the planet, those numbers are not overwhelming. But the reality is, tens or even hundreds of millions of people shifting from I used to do this, now that job is different or not there anymore. I've got to do something else. That's where it really comes down to a much more micro scale. And I think this is where the hype versus reality starts to get traction, is when each of us is dealing with what are the implications for me? What are the implications for my team? What are the implications for my organization? What choices am I going to make? Or what are the implications for my family? And what choices are we going to make? And it's, my encouragement to anybody who's listening is have those conversations, engage with others, get different perspectives, and let's try to work towards some sense of consensus that is at least pragmatic rather than just influenced by the headlines, right? This going back to
Yeah,
this
and
overestimate thing.
so the comment I want to make here is the hype feels like if you just read the newspapers, it feels like AI is happening to you. That there's
Hmm.
a bunch of tech bros in, uh, yeah, I think it's still tech bros in San Francisco who have a handful of companies that are going to dictate our future,
Hmm.
and yet we as individuals have the power to choose. And there are AI models being built that recognize agency. There's an organization called Manifest AI. They're building a different type of LLM. And so it's the power of choice at the individual level. We all are members of society. In this country, we all have a vote. We can all use our voices. AI now can help us amplify our voices. And so I think what I heard you speak to, Gary, is agency. And that in this storm where the hype makes it feel like it's happening to us, how can we maintain our agency within ourselves, within our organizations, within society, within the people we elect to not recreate the industrial age and the slums and the tenements, to not recreate the Rust Belt of the 1980s, to not, to really learn from our history and not create another system that we don't want.
I think to quote Gary back to himself, change is choice, and you can choose to get educated and understand, whether you're in the middle, the bottom, the top of an organization, wherever you are, understand what it can do. Like, I've just talked to my daughter. She's going to be graduating with her associate's degree at the end of this year. Go talk to your counselor. Talk about jobs that you want to do. Understand if they're AI proof or not. Understand how AI is going to impact those. So I think for folks, listening, just learn is a big part of this, because we're talking about hype, but hyperadaptive, which is, the title of Melissa's book, is about understanding so that you can adapt.
And the flow of
Absolutely.
change. Yeah, I mean, Gary, I wanna circle back to what you were talking about change, because the change of change that I see is in the 1940s, what change management was is you had an existing state and you thawed it, and then that what you implemented the change, and then you froze it again. And so it was like this freeze, thaw, freeze. And what we're seeing now, and what sparked it, Kim, was your conversation about your daughter, is the flow of change.
Mhm.
In that careers, maybe 300 years ago, you were a shoemaker, your son was a shoemaker,
Right.
your grandson was a shoemaker, and and then we moved into this place where you could have a career for the length of your lifetime. And I don't know about the both of you, I've had to reinvent myself, maybe 2 or 3 times. Maybe
Yeah.
your daughter is in a much more fluid state. And how do we set the expectation that change is a near constant and we're in the flow of change rather than a state of change that will steady out?
And maybe to coin a term, but I think of this as blobular, right? There are these big influences around which momentum coalesces, and they sometimes move faster, sometimes move slower, sometimes they ooze, and they seem inexorable. They're just going to keep coming. And other times they have to sort of adapt themselves around an obstacle. But understanding that there's that constant motion is, to the point that I think you were making, Melissa, is helpful. It's helpful as individuals. It's helpful as leaders to understand that it's not a freeze, thaw, freeze exercise. It's continual. And that to me is, maybe an underlying theme as we try to wrap up here a little bit about how to be pragmatic and thoughtful and separate the hype, but still be able to exercise our agency when it comes to AI. And, as is our practice, Melissa, I want to give you the last word. Is there anything here that you'd either want to underscore or remind people of, or that we haven't touched on yet before we wrap up this episode?
Well, maybe I'll share a metaphor of the mountain and how I see navigation changing in this moment that we're in. So I feel like in the corporate world, you would set your strategy, and that would be the summit of the mountain. Here's where we're all going together. And there were some pretty established paths up the mountain. Let's just say that it's Everest. You know, you get to base camp, then you get to camp 1, then you get to camp 2, then you get to camp 3, and then you make a push to the summit. And most organizations knew roughly the path, and they could plan for the expedition. And I feel like the shift that we have now is you still need that summit. You still need where we're heading to. But now what we need is we need huts along the way, because the Khumbu ice falls might have just collapsed yesterday, or there are storms constantly in motion on that mountain. And so we need these huts radioing, wow, I can't even say that, radioing to the Sherpas who are then communicating to the climbers what the current conditions are. And so we're on a shifting mountain, and it really changes the way that we're operating. And as we're talking about the bridge between hype and reality, I kind of think that's our new reality, is putting the systems in place to communicate current conditions and not even calling it change.
Lovely. Kim, any last thoughts there?
No,
All
we
right.
gotta end
Good.
there. That was a mic drop moment.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. Love having you on. Look forward to future conversations again. As always, Kim, thanks for being my partner. And for everybody who's listening, thanks for tuning into The Fault Line, the podcast where we talk about hype versus reality, aspiration versus pragmatic solutions. Find us anywhere you get your podcasts, and we look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.